One of the things that my master teacher and I discussed when I had taught my first two lessons for 470 and 460, he's a strong advocate of walking around the classroom, saying that it's effective because sometimes proximity to the student engages them and helps facilitate their learning. So for second period, I decided that I would not leave the front of the classroom, just to see if student work was diminished or if it stayed the same, and how students would react overall. So while in first period I made it a point to walk from the front to the back and to each side of the room, in second period I was strictly in the front only, and I also adapted the lesson a little bit. So while in first period I had students work in groups at the beginning in the warm-up, in the intro section, I reversed it in this for the second lesson. For the warm-up activity, I had it individual. So list your ideas on Gandhi individually on your own. And I noticed that students weren't as engaged, and I'm not sure if it was because they weren't working with their peers. Well, actually, I'm rather sure of that. They didn't have anybody to collaborate with. So if one person only came up with one answer, and they didn't have any other idea of who this person was, they weren't even able to really hypothesize on that. Whereas in the first period, if someone didn't know about Gandhi at all, one of their peers might know more information and kind of have a teaching moment with their colleague, their peer. So I had students work alone, and for the second lesson I had the group work done in the assessment and the follow-through. So and the reason I decided to not walk around the classroom this time, from a management perspective, was in reading Society, the Classroom, and Instructional Practices, I came across the reality theory, which basically says that we make personal choices. And I wanted to see if students in the first period were working because I was walking around and my proximity to them made them want to do the work, or if it was a personal choice that they had made to complete the assignment. Also, unlike first period, I was much more engaging with my PowerPoint presentation this time around. I stopped a couple times and I asked students to interact with each other. So I didn't do it in the into, I did it in the through section. I had students work together, and I'd ask a simple question, why do they think that Gandhi stood for nonviolence? I'd give them 30 seconds and they'd talk, and I'd choose on different students. So they all had an opportunity to talk sometime throughout the lesson. And I found that more interactive, it was more engaging, and overall, as our readings pointed out in the same book as I mentioned earlier, I communicated the material in a manner that was understandable to them because I didn't have such an issue with students putting their head down and kind of dozing off as I did in the first period. And I'm not sure if it was because first period's earlier in the morning and by second period they're more awake now, or if it really was that I was engaging students more so they were more prone to stay alert and active as I kind of progressed through the lesson. But some of the observations that I made, at least for the warm-up, some students didn't really participate. I called on 3 or 2 students, and I asked them what they thought about Gandhi, and they just shrugged. And I was kind of disappointed because I had told them to, if they had no idea who he was, to at least take a guess. And some students didn't even go that far. So I'm wondering if they had been in pairs, maybe they would have written down a couple things. I'm led to the conclusion that, at least in second period class, no proximity equals no supervision, and without supervision, some students are more prone to stay off task and not really focus on what their assignment is. One thing I did notice, up in the front, there's an ELD student, and I've observed him throughout the semester, and he's very engaging with his peers. Like he pushes them to work, even some of his English speaking peers. So I thought that was interesting how he kind of pushed. I don't know if it was because I was near him, so he kind of wanted to get the work done, or if that's just in his nature. From what I've seen, I think it is in his nature, but I'm not too sure. So what worked and what didn't work? I think, at least for the individual warm-up activity, I did not think that was very effective. I think when I'm going to introduce a new subject to students and I'm asking them to hypothesize, I think it's much more effective to do so in a group. Maybe a warm-up activity relating to prior history, something we learned the day before, that can be done individually. But if I'm asking students to think about someone new, I think it's good to have that group work environment where students can collaborate together. What did work definitely was the group work in the through section. So here I had the four individuals work together and draft a comparison with Gandhi's movement to a movement of their choosing in history. And at least the quality of the documents were much more effective than they were in first period when they were done individually. And I think partly, it's I was giving them information, then asking them to compare it without really giving them the time to analyze and think about Gandhi's work. So maybe if this was done over the course of a week, maybe students would be able to really think about the concepts that Gandhi implemented and somehow relate them back to history. But it did work in a group setting, so I appreciated that. On top of that, I think what did work was me stopping the PowerPoint and making sure students came back onto task. I noticed in the graphic organizer that I gave the students to follow along on the PowerPoint, some of them hadn't written anything down in first period. So in second period, I took the time to stop and say, we just talked about X, Y, and Z, and this is kind of fits in the category of actions that I have in your graphic organizer. So if you haven't written anything down, this would be a good point to make. And actually students kind of scribbled down, and then a few students I noticed, at least in the front, made a couple of notes. And definitely what did not work in second period was not walking around the classroom. At least in second period, that environment is one where, as a teacher, as an educator, we need to walk around the classroom to make sure that students are on task and doing what they're supposed to be doing. So the second period was kind of a mixed bag. There were some strategies that I used that I didn't care for and I wouldn't use anymore, like individual warm-ups for something that we're going to hypothesize on. But in the end, overall, it was a learning experience for me as an educator in terms of management style in the classroom.